Satyasatya Sri Srimad His Divine Grace Shilabhai Charanarvind Bhakti Vedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki ISKCON BBT Founder Acharyas Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada Ki Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Prem Se Gaho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Giridhara Sri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Ki Sri Sri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shamakunda Radhakunda Giri Govardhan Ki Sri Vrindavan Mathura Dham Ki Sri Dwarka Dham Ki Sri Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Sri Navadip Mayapur Dham Ki Sri Mayapur Chandradev Mandir Ki Gaṅgāyām Jamunamai Ki Tulsi Revi Bhakti Revi Ki Harinama Sankirtan Ki Samaveta Bhakti Vrinda Ki Transcendental Book Distribution Ki Jai Shri Shri Gauranitai Ki Jai Shri Sri Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Devi Ki Jai Shri Krishna Balaram Ki Jai Shri Giri Govardhan Ki Jai Shri Sri Radha Madhava Ki Jai Nitai Gaura Premanande
Hari Hari Bol.
All glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Guru, to Sri Gauranga, all glories to Sri Prabhupada. Om Ajnanatmirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Jena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha Sri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Juta Padakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavam Scha Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatam Vitam Tvam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Sri Vishakanditam Scha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tata Kansana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanusute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tirubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Vyaivacha Patitam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udiraya Nasta Prayesha Badrishu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavatu Tamashloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtaki Idam Bhagavatam Nama Puranam Brahma Samhitam Uttama Shloka Charitam Chakara Bhagavan Rishi Nishreyasaya Lokasya Dhanyam Swasyanam Mahat Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Giridhara Sri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Sri Surabhyaya Namaha.
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 Mukhaṁ karoti vāsaram pāṇḍūnāṁ mangayate girim yatkripatamaham bande Sri Gurum Dinataranam yatkripatamaham bande Sri Gurum Dinataranam. Today we continue our reading from the first canto of the Bhagavatam. And chapter 4, appearance of Sri Narada, and text number?
10.
Number 10, eh? Yes. Okay. Samrāṭ kasya va hetoḥ pāṇḍūnāṁ māna-vardhanaḥ prāyopaviṣṭo gaṅgāyām anādṛtyādhirāṭ-śriyam samrāṭ kasya hetoḥ pāṇḍūnāṁ māna-vardhanaḥ prāyopaviṣṭo gaṅgāyām anādṛtyādhirāṭ-śriyam sa samrāṭ kasya hetoḥ pāṇḍūnāṁ māna-vardhanaḥ prāyopaviṣṭo gaṅgāyām anādṛtyādhirāṭ-śriyam sa samrāṭ kasya hetoḥ pāṇḍūnāṁ māna-vardhanaḥ prāyopaviṣṭo gaṅgāyām anādṛtyādhirāṭ-śriyam
samrāṭ kasya hetoḥ pāṇḍūnāṁ māna-vardhanaḥ prāyopaviṣṭo gaṅgāyām
anādṛtyādhirāṭ-śriyam
samrāṭ kasya hetoḥ pāṇḍūnāṁ
māna-vardhanaḥ
prāyopaviṣṭo gaṅgāyām
anādṛtyādhirāṭ-śriyam
samrāṭ kasya hetoḥ pāṇḍūnāṁ
māna-vardhanaḥ prāyopaviṣṭo gaṅgāyām anādṛtyādhirāṭ-śriyam sa samrāṭ kasya hetoḥ pāṇḍūnāṁ
anādṛtyādhirāṭ-śriyam
saha he samrāṭ the emperor kasya for what va or hetoḥ reason Pāṇḍūnāṁ of the sons of Pāṇḍu māna-vardhanaḥ one who enriches the family prāya-upaviṣṭaḥ sitting and fasting gaṅgāyām on the bank of the Ganges anādṛtya neglecting adhirāṭ acquired kingdom śriyam opulences. Translation purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki. He was a great emperor and possessed all the opulences of his acquired kingdom. He was so exalted that he was increasing the prestige of the Pāṇḍu dynasty. Why did he give up everything to sit down on the bank of the Ganges and fast until death? Kindly repeat after me. He was a great emperor.
He was a great emperor.
And possessed all the opulences. Of his acquired kingdom. He was so exalted. That he was increasing. The prestige of the Pāṇḍu dynasty. Why did he give up everything? To sit down on the bank of the Ganges. And fast until death. Purport. Maharaj Parikshit was the emperor of the world and all the seas and oceans, and he did not have to take the trouble to acquire such a kingdom by his own effort. He inherited it from his grandfathers, Maharaj Yudhisthira and brothers. Besides that, he was doing well in the administration and was worthy of the good names of his forefathers. Consequently, there was nothing undesirable in his opulence and administration. Then why should he give up all these favorable circumstances and sit down on the bank of the Ganges, fasting till death? And this is astonishing, and therefore all were eager to know the cause. Translation again. He was a great emperor and possessed all the opulences of his acquired kingdom. He was so exalted that he was increasing the prestige of the Pāṇḍu dynasty. Why did he give up everything to sit down on the bank of the Ganges and fast until death? So naturally, for someone who doesn't know the story, that question will come. Why did such an exalted personality, the emperor of the world, having all kinds of opulence, all kinds of prestige, living in a very, we can say materially speaking, comfortable position. Why would anyone in that kind of opulent condition leave everything? Of course, we will be reading more in terms of the reason, which those who have read the Bhagavatam already have some idea about it. But this is beyond the example of Parikshit Maharaj. We should know that actually this is part of the Vedic culture. That one who is cultivating a spiritual life in the days when Vedic culture was being followed, everyone was actually encouraged, and so many facilities were arranged as well to practice spiritual life. Vedic culture means a culture of spirituality. The very word Arya, Aryan culture, Aryan culture, or Aryas. That's why Krishna is reminding Arjuna that you're speaking like this, you become confused. You're not. You want to leave the battle. You're not an Aryan. So Aryan means actually one who is cultivating the long-standing, ancient spiritual culture of Sanatana Dharma. And this, of course, included especially personalities who were, like Parikshit Maharaj, responsible to govern, either a country or, in his case, the whole world. He was emperor of the world. But the culture was such that, very interesting, actually, a few days back I was reading a purport, a very powerful purport that Prabhupada wrote in the light of the Bhagavata. This is an interesting book that Prabhupada wrote before going to the West. The light of the Bhagavat. And in one of those purports, it would be nice to have the purport here because very, very powerful statements made by Srila Prabhupada, whereby he mentions that no later than the age of 50, this is Vedic culture, at the age of 50, one should
leave the house.
Abandon everything, yeah. So you're doing it. Yeah. One should leave family, take vanaprastha or sannyas, depending on the situation. And in that purport, in the light of the Bhagavat, Srila Prabhupada was actually mentioning how there should be legislation passed that no politician can be elected after the age of 50.
You were speaking.
Huh?
You were speaking like that.
Yes. I mean, the purport was about, giving up family life, and specifically he spoke about politicians and how, as we know, politicians, they'll hold on to their post till their 80s, even 90s. They're so attached. So that's because they are lacking this spiritual culture. So therefore, Rajarishi, evam parampara praptam imam Rajarsayo vidu. Rajarishi, Raja and Rishi, simultaneously materially qualified as well as spiritually qualified. And there are many examples actually in the Srimad Bhagavatm. Bharat Maharaj is one such example. As soon as sons are grown up, as soon as they can take up the responsibility of governing, then one would leave. One would leave, understanding that actually the primary goal and objective of life is to become self-realized, to become fully, completely detached from material life, and to prepare oneself to go back home, back to Godhead. So this is actually the very attractive aspect or the beauty of the Vedic culture, is that everything is very nicely explained, and everyone within society, when there are responsible leaders, of course in Kali Yuga we only know largely speaking of irresponsible leaders, isn't it? And who are the three natural leaders in society? There are many leaders. Who are the three natural leaders? What does it mean actually to be a leader? To be a leader means to lead somebody.
Know everything.
Huh?
Should know everything.
Should know everything. Yes, should be knowledgeable, but what I'm looking for specifically is this aspect that leader means he has dependence, isn't it? People are accepting him as a responsible person, and basically there's two kinds of people in the world: people who lead and people who follow.
Head of state.
Huh?
Head of state.
Head of state, yeah. But there are three natural leaders in society. That means three natural leaders who have dependents under them. And when they misuse their position, those dependents suffer. And this, we could say, has been the history of Kali Yuga. And therefore, the general position of most people, most leaders in present-day society, is that they reject, for example, monarchy, because monarchy has been abused in Kali Yuga. We have seen, the whole history is there, repeated misuse of power. You see, being a king, being a leader, one generally has, especially a leader of a country, has a lot of power, because he has a lot of opulence, and he governs over many persons. And if one is not strong in one's God consciousness or Krishna consciousness, he will misuse that power that he has. So the three natural leaders in the context of Vedic culture, there are others, the three main natural leaders are those who are Brahmanas, those who are Kshatriyas, and those who are Vaishyas, what we call the Dvijas. We're talking about the Dvijas, twice born. They're the natural leaders in society. And when they are not present, so therefore the situation becomes chaotic. And if they are present but not qualified, situation also becomes chaotic, isn't it? And therefore, we need to hear and to read about examples such as Parikshit Maharaj and others in the pages of the Srimad Bhagavatm, who taught by example, who were qualified both materially, having undergone training in Gurukula, in the traditional system of education, where one learns the art of becoming a Brahmana, the art and the science of becoming a Kshatriya. Gurukula is also for Vaishyas, but generally they don't stay. Each will stay according to how much they need to learn. And both of these three categories are also meant to give spiritual guidance, because they are meant to cultivate spiritual life every day. This is how the Vedic culture is set up. And therefore, if one throughout one's life cultivates spiritual life, then one knows from the very beginning that actually I need to be to become more and more detached from material things. I need to be detached from family life in particular, which is described as being the strongest attachment. So it means that whenever the opportunity presents itself, then one will abandon that, very exalted position of being the king of a country or the emperor of the world, as is shown here actually by Parikshit Maharaj. We are in modern day society very far from that kind of culture, and that is precisely why Srila Prabhupada introduced the teachings of the Bhagavatam, especially, as well as the Bhagavad Gita in the Western countries, so that not only people in the Western countries, but also people in India, because that has been unfortunately neglected. In one place, actually, Srila Prabhupada makes the following statement, which is kind of a heavy statement, mentioning how because India has not actually taken up its natural mission of spreading Krishna consciousness, therefore we have what we have today in the world, a world that is far from being God conscious and a very confused and chaotic situation all over. So therefore, the need for cultivating...
There used to be one Brahmana who used to advise the king what to do and what not to do.
Yes, yeah, that where is that now? Yes, that was one of the important duties and responsibilities that those who were, normally Brahmanas would spend longer time in the Gurukul. They would more deeply study the Shastra. They were expected to be more knowledgeable in all kinds of knowledge, both spiritual as well as material. And therefore they were in a position to advise the monarchs or the kings. And we see this, of course, described in the Bhagavatam, that the kings would consult. As a matter of fact, in the Kautilya Arthashastra, it mentions how, very nicely detailed, the different activities of a king during the day, It was very, very regulated. And at one particular time, he would take counsel from Brahmanas. That, unfortunately, is no longer there. And one of the very major challenges that is presently there, or is presently here in Kali Yuga, in our present time, is the the rift, the difference, the rift, the separation that has come about, and this goes back many years, between the Brahmanas and the Kshatriyas. That's a very big topic, actually, and a very a delicate and controversial one as well. Vedic culture, these two very powerful personalities, someone who is actually a qualified Brahmana, someone who's a qualified Kshatriya, they are very powerful. The Brahmana is powerful in terms of his knowledge, isn't it? In terms of his renunciation, just like so many examples are there. Brahmana, that's why only depends on the Lord. He's not dependent on anyone. So that's the power of the Brahmana, whereas the power of the Kshatriya is that he has all kinds of opulence, he controls so many persons, and he's physically powerful as well. And these two individuals are actually meant to be very close. They're meant to be very... Actually, when they study in the same Gurukul, naturally they develop a friendship, which will generally continue for the whole life. Unfortunately, that is missing, practically speaking, not existing. And therefore, that is part of what our ISKCON society actually is mandated to do by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada wanted specifically that we train a qualified class of Brahmanas, qualified class of Kshatriyas, qualified class of Vaishyas, and also a qualified class of Brahmanas, of Shudras. Anyone who is agreeable to be part of that system that Krishna has created is actually a very elevated person, you see. And therefore we find in the Bhagavatam, especially the description given by Srila Narada Muni, how civilized life, civilization begins when one is part of the system of Varna and Asrama. It means that one actually accepts the natural system whereby one more easily and more quickly will be able to advance in spiritual life and learn to gradually more and more be detached from this material world. So whether we have any comments or questions on this morning? And the purport Prabhupada mentions that he was doing well. Parikshit Maharaj, it's not that he lived because there were problems. There were no problems. He was in full control of his kingdom. He had the support that he needed, and everything was going well. Yet he left everything.
Now we are having these books, Bhagavatam and all,
Yes.
in a written. Those days, other written books are only by lecture only they will.
So the question is that today we have these books,
Yes, yes.
or these...
And on those days, so many people were there, rishis and all, they were asking these questions.
Yes.
They were not studying those books and all.
Oh, but they were. You see, we have not experienced that, but that was in the days when that culture, you know, where Sanatan culture, Sanatan Dharma culture was followed. People were practicing various forms of spiritual life, and some people, you know, previously when there were no books, people, they would hear. That is still the system that is followed, except that we have books because we cannot remember so easily. But previously people were much more able, more easily able to remember, and that was part of the culture, that sadhus or saints would travel, and every day they would. I mean, we see this even just a few decades ago. You know, during Srila Prabhupada's time, for example, where in the evening in the villages, especially when before the advent of television, people would hear and recite Ramayana and Mahabharata. So that practice was there. In terms of the Bhagavatam, we hear from the Bhagavatam itself how it was, the Vedic literatures were put into written form 5,000 years ago by Srila Vyasadeva. Before that, the Vedic literatures were there, but they were transmitted orally. And therefore, because prior to Kali Yuga, people lived for longer period of time, number one. Secondly, their memory was much more developed. And therefore, people would, because that was part of the culture, people would study the entire Vedas. They would study thousands and thousands of verses from the different Vedas. And therefore, just like we were discussing, Venugopal Prabhu and myself, how even today we have people who have the title of, Trivedi and Chaturvedi, indicating that they were coming from that line. Of course, nowadays, even if somebody has that name, Chaturvedi, he doesn't even know one Veda, what to speak of four. But that was the custom, that was the tradition. And so different sadhus who were at this reunion, who had gathered at Naimisharanya, they were all cultivating, as a matter of fact, it mentions they were like the best of the brahmanas who had come. Dvija, what is it? Dvija Vesta? Yeah.
But previously they used to write on the manuscripts also. That means they used to have the tal trees leaves.
Yes.
In that leaves they used to write.
Before books, but even before that they would memorize.
Memorize, and even Vyasdeva asked to Ganesh to write.
Right. Yeah.
And he wrote the Sal Puranas and everything.
Yes.
Vedas.
Yes.
Writing habits, they used to write even in that's the starting of Kali Yuga also.
Okay.
But if anyone wants some book, they will write it. Srila Prabhupada also mentions in one place, we don't need to have these books, this is junk books all, and they are wasting the paper. So
yes.
If anyone wants, just they have to copy.
They have to, yeah. That was the system during Lord Chaitanya's time, actually.
Yeah.
When Lord Chaitanya came back from South India, he had brought 2 books, right? The Brahma Samhita and one more. Yeah. And all the devotees started to copy their own copy. So one would value, when you copy your own book, you look after it. That was the system before, yeah. And previously, books that were printed, whenever books started to be printed, were primarily books of sacred books. Even Prabhupada explains how previously, whenever there would be dramas, it would be in connection with Shastra, in connection with spirituality.
Nowadays, Bhagavatam, Mahabharata,
Yes.
one dramas.
That's right, yeah. But now anyone can write a drama and anyone can write a book, and therefore we have all kinds of books which are basically, distractions. Here's a question actually coming through internet here. How can we shift PPL? How can we shift from following Asuric Varnashram to Daiva Varnashram? Yes. That's a good question. In many ways, Varnashram, because the modes of material nature are there, one follows some kind of Varnashram. People have different kinds of occupations. How to convert or change that Asuric Varnashram into Daiva Varnashram, which is what our acharyas are inducing us to do, advising us to do. That is by the process especially of purification. And therefore, in the 7th canto of the Bhagavatam, chapter 11, where Narada Muni begins his instructions to Yudhishthira Maharaj on the very topic of Varnashram, he gives a list of the 30 qualities that are needed for someone to actually become a qualified human being. And in one of those purports, Srila Prabhupada nicely explains how the more we have individuals who will develop these 30 qualities, then amongst such persons we can introduce the real Varnashram, the Daiva Varnashram. So to a large extent it is very much on one side a question of purification, which means training and education. We have to introduce this science because it is a science in itself, just like the science of devotional service. Spiritual life is a science in itself, the science of bhakti yoga. In a similar way, Varnashrama is a scientific process which begins by having a proper understanding of the system, and that can only be nicely understood and appreciated if one is purified in consciousness, isn't it? So therefore, developing these 30 qualities of a human being will be helpful. Not only helpful, it is mandatory for us to begin introducing the real system of Daiva Varnashram. And it means that gradually, as devotees become qualified in this way, become qualified both spiritually and materially, they understand how such a system is meant to be implemented, then gradually, as desired by Srila Prabhupada, we need to demonstrate, we need to set up models or prototypes of communities where the individuals in that community are following the principles of Varnashrama Dharma. And of course that means, especially for the majority of people, it means to again be reconnected with the land, to be reconnected with cows, and course, there will be, there needs to be administration, kings, who will generally be having their own, what we call cities today. Cities in bygone days were places where the administration of the country was conducted, and but those cities were planned in a very particular way, the descriptions of which we find actually in the Bhagavatam as well. You know, places like Dwarka and Hastinapur or New Delhi in those days, they were planned out in such a way that it was not at all like they are today. So this was Prabhupada's plan, actually, that devotees get a proper training. Therefore, again, as we often mention and remind ourselves and remind devotees, Varnashram colleges need to be established where such a training actually will be given. Yes? Okay.
Prabhupada is saying here, why should you publish all rubbish literature? Simply publish Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita, that's all. What is the use of this newspaper, nonsense newspaper, huge quantity? So everything will be nice, provided you become ideal, live in community, produce your own food, even you can produce your own paper. You don't require printing of so many books. If there is one book, others can imitate or copy. There is no need of printing.
Which reference is where?
It is in, it's a morning walk, 1974, May 27th in Rome.
In Rome, 1974, morning walk. Srila Prabhupada reminding us that we don't need all of these books that don't have nothing to do with Krishna consciousness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Newspapers and
newspapers and magazines and whatnot. They're basically distractions, isn't it? They're just extension of Gramya Katha, which is taking us further and further away from the real purpose of life. Yeah, very true. Okay, so we'll end here. Thank you very much. Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki Jai Srila Prabhupada ki.
His Holiness Bhakti Radha Swami Maharaj ki.